Okay, I'm glad that we have today is Dr. Steinlight. He's a policy analyst, senior policy analyst with the Center for Immigration Studies, which is out of Washington, D.C. He focuses on ascending trends in immigration policy, America's changing demography and culture, politics of immigration, and a lot of other things. He's testified before the Judiciary Committee of the House. He's been on many of the major news networks, and he's an expert, and I'm very happy to have him today. I think you'll all enjoy him, and I'm sure you'll be entertained and come with a lot of, some of it, appalling statistics out of this. So if you'll give him a big East Texas welcome. Stephen?
Share my best personal news. It's my birthday a few days ago, and my eldest daughter gave me the birthday present I had been hoping for the most, and that is that I'm going to be grandpa on 21 September. Anyway,
Stephen, hold the microphone a little closer.
How's this?
Everybody here?
Is this okay? Better? Thank you. Well, good afternoon. It's an honor to address We Are Grassroots America, We the People, Tyler's Tea Party. I'm very grateful to Joanne Fleming, your executive director, head of the Texas Tea Party caucus and leader of the Tea Party campaign for Senator Cruz in the Lone Star State, and for the opportunity to speak to the second largest and most influential Tea Party in Texas. And I've spoken to a lot of Texas Tea Parties. I also wish to extend hearty thanks to Ashton Orovitz III, my good angel with regard to making this event happen, seeking additional venues. He has been nothing but helpful, kind, and friendly. It's very good to return to Texas, and thank you all very much for coming. There is so much to cover that if I were to speak at epic length, and you may experience it that way, not pausing even if many of you keel over and croak, I would barely skim the surface. That said, I'm going to try to do some justice to immigration as an issue in its own right, with attention to immigration history, policy, and politics. But even the most ambitious and detailed remarks would amount to very little if they didn't underscore the centrality of my subject to the most important social and political reality facing America. And that is the earthquake of fury in response to the long-term economic and cultural consequences of our horrendous immigration policy and related ones, which shifting tectonic plates is reshaping our society and national politics. The toxic primaries and the bitter election which will surely follow reflect the politics of backlash and cultural anxiety, and these run very, very deep. We might approach this upheaval initially by posing any one of several questions. Why the fury against the political elites? Why does a tottering Republican establishment imagine it can ignore the will of primary voters at the nominating convention and not reap the whirlwind? They've been bluntly warned by Ted Cruz and Paul Ryan's home district of the danger of harboring such pipe dreams, and Donald, true to character, has threatened an insurrection. The GOP establishment's worst-kept secret is its scheme to use Cruz as a firewall against Trump before dumping him and bestowing the nomination on one of their own. Last Sunday, many of you probably watched ABC's This Week's Roundtable. GOP strategist Alex Castellanos observed that if Trump loses the first ballot, support for Cruz among party regulars will quote-unquote evaporate and shift to someone else on a second or third. These are party regulars, he said. They don't want Cruz. Cruz's value evaporates once Trump is no longer a threat. This is what comes of investing too much sovereignty in delegates who can cut deals like rug makers in Marrakesh. I don't like this system. Yes, the Donald had used it and has whined about it, but the fact is, this system is broken. Senator Cruz is doing well at the moment, cracking, packing, and stacking delegations with his own supporters, But he's not alone at being able to poach them, and he's going to find himself in a bidding war with the entire official apparatus of the GOP. Though the practice is within the rules, there's no illegality here, it's a private club, the Republican Party, it comes close to nullifying the democratic process after the fact. See Louisiana in particular, or replaces it with the will of party activists, as in Colorado, where no vote took place. You may like the outcome, but the process is despicable. We'd be better off without it, and I hope after this election that the Republicans change their patterns and the Democrats get rid of their superdelegates. It's time-honored and it's within the rules, and there is, of course, something odd about Mr. Trump, the great deal-maker, whining about a delegate ground game he conceded. Predictably, though, it's now causing a firestorm of criticism from Trump supporters like Matt Drudge, Pat Buchanan, Michael Savage, the Union of Border Patrol Officers, and so on. Despite ritual denials, like the beneficiary of a GOP coup, we all know would be Paul Ryan. He never stopped denying he would become Speaker, if you remember correctly. Immediately following his April 8th release of that campaign video, supposedly preaching Republican Party unity, the headline in the Drudge Report was, quote, Paul Ryan launches his first campaign ad. Now, does the GOP establishment seriously believe it could walk away unscathed after ignoring 75% of GOP primary voters who've chosen to support either a total outsider like Donald Trump or the quintessential outsider on the inside, Senator Cruz? 75% is a huge majority, but it's likely to approach or exceed 90% by the time California comes in. Do they plan to chuck Rule 40B? Their arrogance is impressive, and it would appear they have learned nothing from the Tea Party rebellion and nothing from the general feelings of outrage against party establishments. Any scenario that doesn't end with Ted Cruz or Donald Trump as the nominee won't merely mean the loss of a presidential election. It may be lost in any case. It may spell the eclipse of the Republican Party for a decade or more. It could even lead to its unmaking. Among other urgent questions, and I'm going to move more to my area, why the reemergence of what Pat Buchanan denominated the silent majority? An alienated, rambunctious, politicized, mostly white middle class and working class. Why the groundswell in favor of economic nationalism and what's long been heretical to the GOP establishment, a desire for greater protectionism and reining in free trade? Or we could narrow it down to one question: why the gravity-defying candidacy of the Donald, and why now? As a preface, I'm going to talk briefly about the revival of American populism. To that end, I'm going to concentrate on Donald's unlikely candidacy. Please do not mistake this for an endorsement. I'm not endorsing Donald Trump. The approach is justified, and I will shift away from him in a little bit, because Trump's unlikely campaign is the most dramatic evidence of the crisis of confidence Americans are feeling in our national institutions. I mean, if anyone who knows that little about what's going on could have gotten this far, we're in trouble. If one is seeking the most vivid embodiment of the spirit of the times, the bright orange Donald Trump is the first person at whom one might gawk in wonderment. From the moment Trump leapt to the head of the Republican pack, pundits have been trying to make out why he is popular. In the beginning, most dismissed him as an exhibitionist buffoon, an embodiment of contemporary reality TV narcissism. His calculated crudeness, cavalier approach to facts, and sketchy knowledge of policy haven't entirely dispelled those ideas. Later, as the size and fervor of his political following surged, they have portrayed him more ominously as the reincarnation of European fascism, and comparisons to Mussolini and even Hitler are ubiquitous. But after racking up victories all across America, and in most contests, and Wisconsin is the exception, he has carried every GOP demographic other than self-described extreme conservatives, it's obvious that neither one of those identities explains what's happening. Nor is it wise, as some Stop Trump people are doing, to label his supporters as thuggish white trash, lumpen proletariat. That kind of language is going to come back and bite the people who use it. There's actually nothing new, foreign, or fascistic about Trump's rhetoric. It reflects a very particular American political tradition. Voters may not recognize it intellectually, but they feel it viscerally when a politician taps into it, as Trump has done, and something inside responds to it. Maybe not for you, but for many others. What Trump has done is to emulate an American historic model of leadership. Geography helps us find its location. Look at a map and look where Trump has done especially well. His support is nationwide, but it's concentrated most strongly in and near the Appalachian states, from Mississippi and Alabama all the way to western Pennsylvania and New York. The northeast corner of South Carolina is probably the epicenter of the pro-Trump parts of the country. You know, we tend to think of movement and change as the basic reality of American life. Now, everything's going by so fast. But some areas resist change, and Greater Appalachia has remained culturally distinct. From the 1700s onwards, large groups, mostly Scots and Scots-Irish, settled in this mountainous frontier, and they helped build America. Their descendants endured tough lives on hard, washed-out hillside farms, in coal mining disasters, and extreme poverty. Modern Appalachia has excellent roads, new auto factories. It's got lovely resorts. If you've been to Asheville, just a beautiful place. And Asheville reflects its unique culture. And of course, it's had fresh waves of migration. But its electorate is older. It's an older version of America. It is more rural, it is more white, it is more conservative. I guess it's not a whole lot different than this county right here. In a crude, loudmouthed, ostentatiously rich New York real estate tycoon, Appalachians see a type of leader they have seen before. People who know their U.S. history will recognize Donald Trump as a kind of reincarnation of Andrew Jackson. Trump's campaign echoes the raucous style of Andrew Jackson, and the states where Trump is strongest are those that most favor Jackson in his 3 runs for the White House. Trump's issues obviously are different, but he shares Jackson's worldview. He vows he's going to fix his supporters' problems no matter what, and he doesn't fret very much about what happens to the people who get in his way. He is a wealthy celeb, always looking for a fight. He's a super patriot who promises to make America great again. He vows to attack government corruption and defend the common man. Super patriotism is his strongest conservative credential. It is also, I would say, arguably his only conservative credential. Apart from believing in tax breaks for the wealthy, he is not a conservative economically. His vow to maintain big government entitlement programs at current levels is almost a sufficient indication right there. He is simply incapable of pulling off a credible impersonation of a social conservative, as that very embarrassing interview about abortion attests. And he certainly doesn't wear religion on his sleeve. You may remember his response. I mean, I have to say I loved it. When one of the press people asked about his favorite verse in the Bible, he said it's just too personal to discuss. He's just to the right of center, just to the right. And by the way, that's where most Americans actually are. If you want a consistent conservative, there's no question who your choice is, and it is Ted Cruz. Populism and conservatism overlap here and there, but the overlap shouldn't be exaggerated. Now, you remember Andy Jackson won the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. He became a national celeb. Loyal staff officers wrote what was probably the first American campaign history ever written, and they showed what a brutal SOB he could be. He had no problem shooting his own men for dereliction of duty. It did not hurt him. That fame won him the White House in 1828 on his second try, He blamed a narrow defeat in 1824 on a corrupt deal between John Quincy Adams and Speaker of the House Henry Clay. He was supported by ordinary citizens, and they voted in numbers in which they had never voted before. He invited common folk to the White House to celebrate his first inaugural, and they busted up the place. Jackson's rivals saw him as a barbarian and a threat to the Republic. He crushed them. And for the record, he had wild hair. Remind you of anyone else. Like Trump, Jackson made his fortune in real estate, buying and selling vast tracts of southern land. If the land he wanted was owned by Indians, he bribed them. If bribing didn't work, he bullied them into selling it cheap. Again, like Trump, he was a problem solver who did not lose much sleep over ideological or political consistency. He became a member of the wealthy elite. By the way, his own origins were poor. He was an orphan. But he ran for president as an opponent of wealthy elites and successfully won working people by fighting the big banks. He defended liberty while operating a personal empire of cotton plantations using hundreds and hundreds of slaves. Jackson and his Democratic Party stood for a certain idea of America, an America for free white people. He had personal friendships with people of other races, but their rights were of no concern to him. When Southerners grew tired of Indian nations in their midst, he booted them west to Oklahoma. Like Trump, Jackson was a super nationalist, and it's not hard to imagine what Jackson would have thought about globalism or multilateralism. Not hard to imagine what he would think about cry bullies on campuses. My guess is he'd shoot them. Trump's an American firster who is deeply suspicious even of traditional alliances like NATO. He's not a strict isolationist the way the hubris-prone neocons would have it. I mean, they want to involve us everywhere. And he will not commit American treasure and lives abroad unless American interests are immediately at stake. And he's sick of the fiscal burden of defending rich allies like Germany, Japan, and South Korea. Trump's proposal for a complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until the government, quote, can figure out what's going on has a muscular simplicity and icy logic that echoes Jackson, as does his promise to make Mexico pay for the wall. Details aside, by the way, the idea of doing it by withholding remissions that Mexicans send home is a rather clever idea, considering right now that amounts are $30 billion a year, and in the 90s it amounted to about $80 billion a year. The people Trump favors are to be protected from all harm. Those that don't count. Foremost among those who do not count are illegal aliens and Muslims who would substitute Sharia for the Constitution. Now, I have got no issue with those exclusions. I have no problem excluding Muslims or illegal aliens. I support that position. But Trump needs to avoid populism's original sin, and that is that it has been deaf or worse on the issue of race, and thus far he's not done enough to distance himself from racism. His failure to disown the support of the KKK immediately suggests that might have been a dog whistle to white nationalists. His challenge is to make the group of people he wants to protect larger. And that's a big challenge, by the way, for the whole Republican Party. But you don't do it by throwing out your base, which is what Romney did in 2012. First, it's right, and second, it might yield results one day. Hillary Clinton, if you've noticed, is not winning black voters in the North or the upper Midwest, only in the South. They're up for grabs. And somebody fighting the great sucking sound of free trade, as Ross Perot would have called it, or the immigration that's killed their jobs, has a shot. And he should make a play for it. He's not likely to get much now. Even when obvious self-interest clashes with ideology, I mean, nothing would be clearer than that African Americans should oppose this insane immigration policy we've got. Ideology wins. Ideology always beats self-interest. It's an amazing thing. Look at the Jewish vote, okay? In the same vein, he could oppose illegal immigration by pointing to the relatively high crime rate of Mexican illegal aliens and Mexican immigrants, but he doesn't need to call all Mexicans rapists. Trump's opposition to Muslim immigration isn't, however, about simple bigotry or instinctive xenophobia. And here I want to give him a pat on the back, and then we're going to move. I think it shows foresight and courage. He's being realistic about a threat to national security and cultural cohesion, and he doesn't want America to follow the suicidal path that Europe has tread. I have been waiting 30 years for a prominent American to challenge political correctness on Islamic immigration. I mean, otherwise I'm thinking we're going to end up being Europe, inevitably. Well, he's done that. He's the first person who has stood up and done it. And he deserves our credit. He deserves credit for that. He needs to make finer distinctions. We need ideological tests and better intel. Not all Muslims need to be excluded, but certainly Muslims who are Sharia compliant must be. And of course, all of those refugees who are pouring into Europe, about whom it is impossible to do any vetting, all of them should be kept out of this country. Now, populism is roaring back because ordinary Americans are feeling extremely vulnerable, and they feel the need for a democratic leader to defend them against privileged elites. In America today, we have two castes of citizens. There was an excellent piece many of you may have read in the Wall Street Journal about 3 weeks ago by Peggy Noonan, who's one of my favorite conservative writers. And she talked about the protected and the unprotected. The protected make public policy, and the unprotected live it. The protected get educated in all the best places, they know the right people, they're secure, successful, and they have political power, or they've got access to it. They are protected from the world they create. We are not. The protected include the political and fiscal elite, and they tend to cluster in government, politics, the media, entertainment, and the higher echelons of corporate America. They live in tony, crime-free places, their kids go to good schools, and they don't serve in the military. Their privileges isolate and buffer them. In effect, they get a safe conduct pass through history. While they attack the Second Amendment as something that only barbarians would want, many of them have their own security details. The alienation of ordinary Americans has been a prime factor in the fact that our voting turnout is so anemic, it's embarrassing. And of course, this is something that Trump talks about a lot. Whether he can deliver is another matter. Figures from the past 6 presidential elections show a turnout as low as 49% in 1996 to a high of 56% in 2008. And that increase was, that year, the increase was almost certainly due to the fact that it was the first time in American history that African Americans voted at a higher percentage rate than whites because of enthusiasm about Obama. But we've never hit 60% in a presidential election. That's outrageous. Compare that to other countries in Western Europe. France averages in the mid-80%. Germany averages in the mid-70s. In Britain, it's about 65 to 70%. I mean, they're way above where we are. The GOP needs a huge turnout in white votes to win. And we all know the reason that Romney didn't win in 2012 is that some, depending whose data you believe, anywhere between 6 and 10 million white working class Christian Americans just sat home. They didn't see any reason to vote for him. And I'm not sure, by the way, he gave them any reason. The hottest front burner issue, and here we come to my home territory, is immigration, because it reflects the chasm between the government and the elites and ordinary Americans more than any other issue. A member of the elitist Chicago Council on Foreign Relations once called immigration policy the perfect policy storm for that reason. You've got the entire elite over here, and you've got one group over here, us, the American people. Ted Cruz is right. Trump did not invent the issue. It's kind of like Trump pretending that he's Al Gore and invented the internet. But to be fair, he put it front and center because he's got an instinct for the jugular. 20 years experience with illegal immigration has taught ordinary Americans a simple, harsh lesson, and it is one they will not soon forget or will not soon forgive. Neither the Democrat Party nor the Republican establishment cares about them. Both refuse to control the border or enforce immigration law inside the United States. My friends, this is not rocket science. The GOP won't because it doesn't want to lose Hispanic votes for a generation, and I can promise you based on what we know about the Hispanic demographic, the GOP will never get more than a tiny slice of that constituency while it throws away its white voters to do it. And to be blunt, it needs to keep its donors and supporters happy in the Chamber of Commerce, agribusiness, construction, and the corporate service sector with lots of cheap labor. It's a great wedge issue for the Democrats who want to own the Hispanic vote, and they look to become a permanent majority party. And when they do, they will shift our politics very hard to the left. If you're watching this campaign, I mean, what is Sanders doing to Hillary? On the one hand, you've got it seems to me, a charlatan ideologue in Sanders, who's like a crazy guy. And then you've got this mendacious, corrupt Hillary. But what he's doing is pushing her further and further to the left. I mean, I hope that's going to be a favorite of us. But God help us if she wins. Ordinary Americans have been hammered by illegal, mass, low-skill immigration, and not just low-skill immigration, but also by higher-skill immigration in STEM fields. While the protected have done just fine, they get workers at cheaper labor, and they get servants at home. The unprotected aren't blind. We have noticed what's been going on. They have not looked out for us. They have not looked out for the country. This has led the unprotected to a logical conclusion. We owe the establishment precisely nothing. No loyalty, no allegiance. Loyalty and allegiance run in two directions. The astronomical level of current immigration, legal or illegal, is the most urgent question facing America. And the reason for that is pretty simple. It has the greatest capacity to transform the nation. It can literally unmake it. What we do about it is the most significant political choice we will make in our lifetime. Whether a recognizable America endures, or alternatively, if we wake up one day and we find we've become strangers in our own land, we are guests in another man's house, that's our decision. And this is a time to make it. If we fail, we're going to find ourselves overwhelmed by the kind of dispossession, that feeling of cultural dispossession Europeans are feeling, and left unchecked in Europe and in this country, I believe it could lead to bloody social upheaval. I don't think you're going to see the massive change in Europe or in this country without a bloody backlash. To fix this system, we have to first reject the historical sentimentalism that can cloud our vision and lead us to affirm policies that might have benefited our forebears, but cause great harm now. Our great-grandparents don't need to be protected. They're already in a better place. Our great-grandchildren do. Immigration is not an idol to be worshipped. It is not an absolute good, regardless of scale, historical content, or the political agenda that it's serving. It is value neutral. It is a means, not an end. If you read Aristotle's Ethics, Aristotle says, what is the goal of wise public policy? It is to create a free, just, law-abiding, virtuous, safe, and prosperous polity. Immigration can either help us or hinder us in terms of achieving it. Aristotle would describe it as an activity. That's the literal word he would have used, not a result. The wrong immigration policy can destroy us, and I think it's in the process of doing it right now. Like all public policy, our assessment of immigration should be based on two fundamental criteria: whether it serves the national interest at a given historical moment, and whether it is arrived at constitutionally. By national interest, I mean the greatest good for the greatest number of American citizens and legal residents, nobody else. And by constitutionally, I mean through laws enacted by Congress, not by a president with a phone and a pen, a petty tyrant who has staged a bloodless coup against a spineless Congress, eviscerated separation of powers, and makes law out of whole cloth. Law is being made these days in the White House, not on Capitol Hill. Though it's a truth we don't like to face, the Constitution no longer governs. We live under a regime where the will of the chief executive has replaced constitutional and statutory law. Throughout history, prerogative law, and that's the term historians and legal historians apply to this, has been a pathway to dictatorship. Our experience with immigration shows how much its value depends on historical circumstances. From the 1840s to 1924, when the great waves arrived from Europe, beginning with the Irish, immigration was a mighty engine of American economic growth and its ascent to global power. That America was a very different place. It's not so much, by the way, that the immigrants are different. What's different is the country they are coming to. And that misfit is critical to understand. We were once the industrial colossus of the world. We were like 5 Chinas. America's economy needed all the workers it could get, skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled. Jobs in an industrial America ultimately paid enough for working-class Americans to evolve into middle-class Americans. We needed millions and millions of small farms to feed a growing population. This is before the rise of the big agribusinesses. There was still an empty continent to fill. That world is gone, turning mass immigration into a counterproductive anachronism. Yet the highest immigration in all of American history took place in the last decade. The foreign-born are now at a record 61 million, or 1 in 5 of us, and 1/3 of them are illegal. And yes, my answer to some left-wing person is, no person can be illegal. Well, I'm sorry, yes, you can be illegal if you break the laws and enter this country. This number breaks sharply even with the recent past. In 1970, this is not exactly ancient history, it's the year I graduated university, only 13.5 million immigrants and their children were here. That accounted for just 1 in 15 of us, not 1 in 5. A recent survey finds 61% of the American people agree that, quote-unquote, continued immigration jeopardizes the United States. Only 7% of Republicans want increased immigration, yet there's only one candidate right now who is calling for a cease in immigration at the moment, and that man is Trump. Something momentous is happening that most people miss. A majority of us, when we worry about demography and growth, we tend to focus on, what an amnesty would cause, for the putative 11 to 12 million here. My think tank is pretty good in crunching numbers, and we tend to be conservative. So, we will go with the figure 11 to 12 million. My own guess is maybe twice as high. That's my own instinct, and I've been looking at this stuff for a long time. Amnesty is a hot-button issue, and it offends our sense of justice and law, and so, we think about it a lot. Other people focus on what demography would be like if any of those horrible, quote-unquote, comprehensive immigration reform bills were to pass. But what happens if they don't? And what happens if we just go along as we are now? That's not what people think enough about, and that's what we got to focus on. Every year, this country admits legally 1 million immigrants, and some 400 to 600,000 illegal aliens enter. That is the equivalent every year, year in, year out, adding 2 cities the size of Philadelphia. The U.S. accepts more immigrants every year than all the rest of the world's countries combined. If we continue, most demographers worth their salt, and this includes people like Robert Rector at Heritage, Steve Camarata, our own guy, they believe that if we continue as we are by 2060, again, it's not so far away, we will rise from the approximately 320 million we are now to 500 million. That's a 56% increase. What does that mean in real terms? How do we visualize that? Well, that would be the equivalent of adding the entire current populations of France, Spain, and Great Britain, and there would be 13 additional cities the size of New York. We will become a third world country with a gigantic underclass. That's what that future will be if we do not stop it. It's up to you and me. They're not going to stop it. And I don't know how many people have looked and remembered, you guys live out here in Texas, the Southwest is a desert. There are just so many people the water can support. A lot of Californians are fleeing California, and they want to go to Colorado. Well, Dick Lamb, the ex-governor of Colorado, is an old friend, and he's been a great supporter on the immigration issue. He said, we don't have enough water in Colorado to bring in very many more people. Looked at the drought in California. By the way, that drought is both, it's natural, it's also man-made. There are a bunch of environmental green crazies there who are destroying the dams and the water reserves and everything else. I know because I stayed on the ranch in Mount Shasta. One guy used to run the water system in California. But the other problem is that if you think of what the population growth is in LA County, it's trebled. So you've got more and more and more people drawing on that water, on that water, which is in a bad way right now. You can't settle parts of the Southwest. Sorry, the territory's there, but you don't have the water. The population accelerator. This is one of the worst of several unforeseen consequences. And this is to answer the question, like, how on earth did all this happen? Of a bill that we passed in 1965, probably, I would say, the most myopic act we've ever passed, and that is the Immigration and Nationality Act of 65. It is an object lesson in how an outdated mindset can prove a disaster. The bill had an admirable goal. And, we all know that road to hell was paved with good intentions. The admirable goal was ending, frankly, bigoted American national origin immigration, which greatly favored Northern Europeans. Now, I think the idea of creating more diversity, by the way, it discriminated against Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans. It wasn't just a matter of bringing in, say, Asians. It was good. It was a good idea. But they didn't put in the safeguards that were necessary to see that it didn't turn into a disaster. They did not peg immigration to fluctuating workforce needs, nor were there any meritocratic criteria for immigrants. It's like, do you have a skill? Do you have an education? Do we have documents that are credible, attesting to the fact that you have a good character? Nothing. The sole engine was and remains extended family reunification, family nepotism. You get an original immigrant, Hernando Sanchez comes from a small village in Mexico, and over 20 years, he and every one of his relatives is here. This is no way to run a system. Now, what's interesting about this is the bill was not intended to increase immigration. None of its supporters believed that it would. Congress was blindsided by something, and that is, I think this is actually very interesting. I know there are people who believe this was a long-term diabolical conspiracy led by Ted Kennedy, Kennedy was a junior senator. Quite frankly, his brains are fried rice. He was the least the least bright bulb on the Kennedy family tree. So believe me, he wasn't full of foresight. The problem was that everyone in Congress and in the United States government was thinking one way. They saw the world in terms of East-West. Communism, capitalism, the Warsaw Pact, NATO. Our radar was not calibrated to pick up other things that were happening. And that was the increasing interface between North-South. I mean, a majority of today's geopolitical issues don't take place East-West. They take place North-South. And by that I mean first world economies versus third world economies, failed states versus successful states, the civilizational clash between Islam and the West, the crisis of migration that we're looking at, pouring into Europe from North Africa, from Arab countries, from places as far away as sub-Saharan Africa and Afghanistan. You're seeing a huge assault on Europe, a demographic assault on Europe. Our political class didn't see any of this coming. In fact, the satellites were up there counting the number of tanks in the Warsaw Pact. They did not tell us that there was a population explosion taking place in the third world. We did not know until it was too late. Mexico's population had doubled in the previous 80 years. Or we did not think hard enough about the fact that the longest border on the planet between a first world economy and a third world economy is the Rio Grande. The 1965 bill wasn't meant to increase immigration. But once it was passed, within 1 year, immigration quintupled. I mean, talk about getting something wrong. Within 5 years, we began to see something we had never seen before on a statistically meaningful basis, and that was we began to see illegal immigration. To grasp the demographic explosion that bill led to, consider this. Most scientists in pertinent disciplines believe that America's first inhabitants came here approximately 13,000 years ago during the Pleistocene Ice Age, when Siberian hunters crossed the land bridge that is now the Bering Sea. That's an immense swath of historical time, 13,000 years. Now consider this. Fully 1/3 of everybody here came since and as a result of the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. That's pretty astounding. 13,000 years go by, and then a bunch of people pass a piece of legislation without thinking about the consequences, and our population, goes off the map. We noted immigration was dramatically lower in 1970, and this is where I want to start linking immigration and the economic problems that are besetting we, ordinary American people. I said it was dramatically lower in 70. That helps us grasp the fiscal impact of immigration. The early 70s is a seminal moment in American socioeconomic history. Most economists believe that is when the great post-World War II economic boom ended and wage stagnation became the new normal for the middle class and the working class. 40 years of economic stagnation is the necessary precondition for the crisis of confidence Americans are now feeling, and which is expressing itself in the rejection of politics as usual, so that we have a kind of crazy, strange, populist figure in Donald Trump. We've got a guy contesting the Democratic nomination who's a self-declared socialist. I mean, something has to account for this. Both major parties are in crisis. Since the economic forces driving this year's nomination have been 40 years in the making, well, why did the dam break now, or let's say recently? Well, the fact is that recent developments greatly aggravated the long-term trends. Foremost among them, the number of manufacturing jobs dropped by 36% from 1979 to 2015. That is a huge drop. We had 19.3 million people working in industrial jobs. Now we've got 12.3. At the same time, the population increased by 43%, from 225 million to 321 million. The post-war boom, measured by the purchasing power of an average paycheck, continued into the early 70s, and then it abruptly stopped. Starting in 2000, conditions got much worse for working class Americans for two main reasons. First, that year marked the end of net upward mobility. Before 2000, the size of both the lower middle class and the middle class had shrunk, and the percentage of houses with adjusted incomes of $100,000 or more grew. Some Americans were still moving up the ladder. But after 2000, the middle class continued to shrink, and so did the number of households that were making $100,000 or more. Now, this is very disconcerting. The only group after 2000 whose numbers have increased very substantially are households in which the earnings are $35,000 or less. That is to say, we've had a gigantic increase in poverty. Americans were moving down. The Pew Center for Research estimates the share of household income going to high-income families rose 20% at the same time. To get a clear sense of what wage stagnation means, if you adjust this for inflation, the average hourly wage has increased from 1964 to 2014 by $1.49. I'm not suggesting, by the way, $15 an hour or any such nonsense. $15 an hour is no damn good. I mean, we need jobs that pay more, jobs you can live on. Only 8 weeks ago, the Pew Center for Research reported an historic finding. Most Americans are no longer middle class. I would have thought that would be a front page story in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal for that matter. But who wants to embarrass His Highness? The second reverse trend is trade with China, which shot up when the Clinton administration let China join the World Trade Organization. China has imposed far larger costs on American workers than most economists anticipated in their wildest dreams, driving millions of American workers out of good-paying jobs in production into low-paying jobs in the service sector. Right now, 80% of American workers are in the service sector. This is not a healthy situation. I mean, I'd like to see the candidates as we go forward into a national election start talking about how they're going to reindustrialize this country. Otherwise, the future is not very bright. Thank you. All the prerequisites for disillusionment with the establishment were now in place. You have a surge of manufacturing products from China, and yes, I know, by the way, there are benefits to that. You know, one reason why, poor folk in America still have stuff, don't look miserable because they can get cheap clothes and they can watch TV sets and so on, is because goods from China are cheap. So it's not all terrible. But, when the balance gets out of whack and your income gets so low, having some toys to play with isn't really much of a return. So you had this tremendous upsurge in Chinese imports, an exceedingly loose job market, and a tepid macroeconomy. Things were going south, and then the cyclone hit. And that was the financial collapse of September 2008. The destruction that collapse wrought was so great that I would say it is the most consequential economic and political event in recent history. And I hope when this campaign, again, starts talking to people as if we're adults, without the idiocy that we're seeing, people will start talking about that recession and what we've done since then and how we're going to get out of this mess. The collusion that it revealed between government and Wall Street, the fumbling response to the meltdown, kind of put the nail in the coffin of trust in government. A majority of those who were most hurt had not benefited from the boom years. They're not big investors in the market. And they became a very receptive audience for the new politics, among which I think the most important expression is the Tea Party movement. A major political provocation then followed. In October of 2008, Congress enacted and President Bush signed the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. TARP funds bailed out major investment banks, made loans and direct equity investments to select auto industry participants, backstop credit markets, and provided a lifeline to American International Group, the insurer AIG. Now, to be fair, the auto industries that were helped and banks have paid back their loans. But the public was shocked by actions that insulated the very institutions and executives that had caused the collapse and protected them from the consequences of the disastrous recession that followed, while ordinary Americans were left out in the cold. Nobody was coming back to their rescue. The resulting anger was huge. Ordinary Americans watched the elites in New York and in Washington rescue the very people who had caused the disaster and give them bonuses, while ordinary Americans lost the value of their homes or lost their homes entirely. And of course, for the great majority of Americans, the house is the biggest investment you've got. Millions lost jobs or saw wages plummet. And we had a situation that I don't think anyone could have imagined. U6 unemployment, which is the best calculator, for what real unemployment is, as opposed to the phony numbers you see out there, like 5%. U6 unemployment shot up to 15.5%. You should remember during the Great Depression, U6 unemployment was 24%. We were in pretty darn bad shape. I'm sure that there is no one in this room, thank goodness, who believes Obama's mendacious assertions that we put the Great Recession behind us, or that unemployment is under 5%, or that we should be thanking him for his stewardship of the economy. But they do live among us. The LFPR, the labor force participation rate, fell at a far more accelerated pace following the Great Recession than it had from 2000 to 2008. For those in their prime earning years, labor force participation has actually fallen at a more rapid pace than of supposedly retiring workers over 55, for whom it has remained relatively flat. The population over 55 is larger than in prior years, and while many in that group do retire, the employment population ratio of our older workers is at an all-time high. That's a very worrying statistic for a lot of reasons. We have 7.2 million more workers in that group working now. First of all, that hurts younger workers because they just can't get into the job market because employment is not catching up with population. And the baby boom generation, my cohort, doesn't feel secure enough to retire. It's holding on to employment by its fingernails to help ourselves and to help our children. People who can't get into the labor market, and by the way, the largest single group impacted by mass immigration are your young 21, 22, 23-year-olds living in your basement, having accumulated hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt to colleges that didn't give them the education they hoped they'd get and the jobs they'd hoped they'd get. They're not entering the job force. And by the way, not having early employment is a detriment that it stays with people over the course of their job lives. It's been particularly brutal on African American youth, who in many cases don't go on to higher education, they don't get early job experience, they don't develop a sense of responsibility that you need. So there are long-term consequences to these things. Now let me say a couple things about all the marvelous jobs that Obama says he's created. Some of the statistics are just jaw-dropping. Of the 12.3 million jobs created since unemployment reached its high point after the Great Recession, 47.6% are in extreme low-wage, long-hour sectors of retail service, administration, waste management, social assistance, leisure, and hospitality. I mean, all those nice young people that check in when you go to a hotel. In mid-2015, hourly wages on average for these jobs stood at little more than $16 an hour with no benefits, and of more concern, almost no one in these jobs was getting more than 30 hours a week at work. As a result, annual income for 13.2 million jobs was around $26,000 a year. Try living on it anywhere else than in your parents' basement. By comparison, only 13.2% of those jobs were in decent-paying, goods-producing areas like manufacture, construction, and mining, where there are 40-hour weeks or more, averaging $26 bucks an hour, where annual incomes are, say, $55,000 a year and up. It's not a king's ransom, but it's an okay situation. We noted the fury with which Americans reacted to TARP. Adding insult to injury, on January 10, 2010, the Supreme Court conferred additional privileges on the income elite in one of the worst decisions I believe it's ever made, and that was Citizens United, which allowed wealthy individuals, corporations, and unions to make unlimited political contributions, turning an already corrupt election system into something akin to oligarchy by permitting the creation of super PACs and giving Wall Street and other financial sectors new ways to own our politicians and our politics. The courts showed that they sided with the elite and not ordinary people. Look, I don't care if your heroes or villains are the Koch brothers, Mr. Edelson, George Soros, Michael Bloomberg, or wealthy Hollywood millionaire morons. They should not own our democracy. It shouldn't be owned by them. I really appreciate your support for that. And by the way, the great majority of Republicans support overturning Citizens United, as do the majority of Democrats. This is something the American people really get right. They understand that we got a handful of people now, just pluck, pulling things around. I mean, our politicians are becoming increasingly like puppets. 2 months after the court's decision, Obama signed the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. A program that many white middle-class and working-class people saw as an assault on their own medical care, the quality of their medical care, their choices in the medical care, to provide coverage to a disproportionately large minority poor in whom Obama has a special interest. This was a classic Obama move. It drove a wedge between the minority poor and struggling white working people. It's not a way to run a railroad if you've got a diverse society and you've got to make win-win situations. These factors energize the Tea Party movement. It's in a way that's kind of where it came from directly. And they can take credit for the sweeping defeat of the Democrats, as well as many rhinos, in the midterm election of 2010. We saw voter anger moving in two directions, against the undeserving rich and against the undeserving poor. But the problem was the 2010 midterm election was an empty victory. The angry voters got absolutely nothing in return. Obamacare survived, and Wall Street and corporate America got richer, and the middle class and working class stayed stuck. And this is a pattern we're going to start seeing in midterm elections. Midterm elections are good for the Republicans. They solidify their control of the House. They don't give us anything. They don't give us the stuff that we're voting for them to give us. It was deja vu all over again, as Yogi Berra would say, in the midterm election of 2014. And I had did I have a big dog. I had a big dog in that fight. And that was in which immigration was supposed to be the central issue in that election. It ended up playing a markedly different role. It smoked out the duplicity of the GOP establishment. By the way, footnote. I spent a lot of time going after Republicans. What's the point of going after Democrats? Okay? I mean, they're dead and buried. They're hopeless. They're irredeemable. They're burning in hell already. I mean, my hope is that the Republicans can do better. It's like, wake up and start acting as though you've got some principles. On paper, your principles are better, but you don't do it. So that's why. It's not that I prefer the Democrats. God help me. I do not. But, what's the point? What's the point of beating on the Democrats? As I said, they decided to sell the country out already. Just like the victory in 2010, this election had zero consequences. The cynical GOP ran the election saying that it was going to stop Obama's immigration policy, particularly the unilateral amnesty, right? And they were going to hold the budget funds for that. Remember? The sequestration, all of that stuff. Exit polls showed that 75% of the people who voted Republican in that election did so to express their opposition to Obama's immigration policy and also the unconstitutional way in which he was going about it, remember? With his phone and his pen. Thanks to the Tea Party, that election was Armageddon for the Democrats. They experienced unmitigated disaster in the House and in state legislatures. It gave Obama one of his only two authentic records. More losses for the party of a two-term president than any other president in the history of America. That's beautiful, okay? Here he's the man in charge and his troops are just dying. The other record he has, which is genuine, is that he has issued he has taken more unilateral actions, that is to say, has run an end run around Congress more times than any other president in history. Now, I like it when Obama supporters want to play the name game with me. So they say, Steve, that's not actually true. I've been in debates on this. They say, actually, if you look, his executive orders are not as, blah, blah, blah. Well, executive orders is only one term for it. He also does what are called memoranda and fact sheets. They're the same things. These are unilateral actions, and he has done so many, he has done more than all of his predecessors combined. That's quite a record. And I love the other responses. Well, the Republicans just say no to everything. Well, some of the things they said no to, they had to say no to, but in any case, you have a president who just determined when he came into office that it was going to be his way or the highway. And he had a totally different ideological outlook, and there was no dealing with him. Look, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill found a way to do business. Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton found a way to do business. This president couldn't do business with anybody, okay? It really is a problem. It gave, Democratic carnage was not only huge on Capitol Hill, the losses in state legislatures were simply unbelievable. 900 Democrat office holders around the country lost. They are at their lowest point in state legislatures in a century. The country has not been this red since Calvin Coolidge. But now we can all yawn, because so what? What are we getting? The GOP won big, but what policies prevailed? The GOP snatched defeat from the jaws of a gigantic win. The colonists, I'm sure you know that wonderful story. M. Stanton Evans was one of the great conservative columnists, a very witty guy. And there were a group of Europeans, this is after the fall of communism, and a group of Europeans from the new now free countries, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and so on, came to Washington, and they had a lot of questions. And M. Stanton Evans is one of the people they met with, and they were struck by the fact that unlike their countries, which have multiple, always European countries tend to have lots of political parties, we only have two. So he said, well, let me explain something about American politics. We have two parties in America. There's the party that I support, and that's the stupid party. And then there's the other party, and that's the evil party. He said, every once in a while, the stupid party and the evil party get together, and they do something that is both stupid and evil. And in America, we call that bipartisanship. So what you've got now is you've got a lame duck president getting every single thing he wants from a GOP-dominated Congress. The Iran nuclear deal, what is he, are Republicans insane? And it was Senator Corker who put the fix in on that. I don't know what he got in return. He got something. Remember, he switched the protocol. Normally, it's the proponents of something like that who have to come up with a supermajority, not the opponents. They switched it. Believe me, when the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade thing comes, it'll be another big sucking sound. There are too many rhinos who are already backing it. We should be fighting that. It was good to see John Boehner's back, okay? I don't know what he's doing now. My guess is he's spending more time on his tanning bed and probably making trillions of dollars representing awful products incorporated on K Street. But we got rid of John Boehner, who, you look up the word empty suit in the dictionary and there is his picture. But we've got Paul Ryan. He is among the biggest supporters of mass immigration and bad trade deals in all of Congress. And he is now going to be the thoughtful intellectual that's going to come out of this chaotic primary season and run on the GOP ticket. I sure as heck hope not. And notice, by the way, that all of the liberal press is now, they're just proclaiming Ryan the philosopher king. This is, by the way, they do this all the time. He's a Judas goat. The liberal press They support things, they try to get Republicans to support things that they know are going to lead to your slaughter. Don't ever take their good opinion as valuable. No, they're trying to lead you down a bad road. And Mr. Ryan is not the guy who's going to get us out of this situation. Now, Ryan, of course, had to make a promise to get the Speaker's gavel, right? And that was he would pass no bill that, while Obama was president, had any immigration component. What was the first thing he did? The omnibus bill. He broke his word. He broke his word immediately. That legislation quadrupled the number of H-2B visas. And then to coincide with the first jihadist attacks committed by refugees in this country, in Houston and in California, the ISIS-inspired cop shooting in Philadelphia, the bill substantially increased funding for quote-unquote Syrian, quote-unquote resettlement. Refugee resettlement. I say quote-unquote Syrian because we have no idea who these people are. And I'm saying quote-unquote refugees because we have no idea if they're refugees. We have no way of vetting them. My answer is very simple. You can't vet, don't admit. I mean, what are we insane? Ryan's bill also failed to fund criminal prosecution and incarceration of apprehended border crossers. So we put the Border Patrol back playing this ridiculous outrageous game of catch and release. It maintains funding for sanctuary cities at current levels. We'll talk about them in a minute. I mean, these are one of the most god-awful things that you can imagine. These are whole areas of our country that have essentially seceded from the rule of law. And it continues to pay illegal aliens earned income tax credits and allow illegal aliens to claim child tax credits on their tax returns. The bill also funds the ongoing relocation in America. Remember in last summer and the summer before, we had that orchestrated arrival of quote-unquote refugees from Central America. Remember the Texas border was being overwhelmed by people from Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala. That was orchestrated by the White House. I mean, why were there military bases already primed to take those people? Where were all those buses from? Why was Catholic Charities in southern Texas already tipped off to get into action? I mean, my guess is that Obama pulled this one off, hoping that the arrival of these little darlings would make us feel much more warm and cuddly about refugees. But of course, the great majority were not unaccompanied children. There were 47,000 families. They essentially just disappeared into America. And the ones who were unaccompanied, for the most part, were adolescent young men who were tattooed wearing the insignia of drug cartels. Then the administration, of course, which lies about numbers and deportations. By the way, Obama's called himself the great deporter. Deportations have fallen 42% since he took office. You can't be deported from America if you beg to be deported. No one will do it. The idea was that no one would, that this had trailed off and the numbers were down, and the idea was that these people only come in the summer, they don't come in the winter. Well, we've seen an increase of 117% arriving. We have now 750,000 people here from Central America, and they are on a program which gets them work authorization. At present, nothing distinguishes the two parties on immigration. They both support amnesty. They both support guest worker programs, and all the guest worker programs are bogus. Why are they bogus? Because guests leave. Guests go home. Sometimes you all have dinner company and it's getting around 12:1, and there's those two people who just will not get out of your house, and you're thinking, what do? You want to throw something at them, release a rat. I don't know. But these people just don't go. Now, we also, we've got this unending stream of people coming in, and Obama is inducing this, as are all the high-tech folks in STEM area work. Science, technology, anyway. We don't need a single foreign person in STEM. We've got the best computer engineers in the world, the best tech people in the world right here. Further, if these fields actually were in such desperate need of more workers, then wages would have risen in them. But wages, in fact, have gone down in STEM fields for the last 7 years. They don't want, as Bill Gates has said, I want to go to Bangladesh and I want to find another Einstein. No, he wants to go to Bangladesh and bring in thousands of people so he can drop wages for mid-level computer analysts by $20,000 a year. That's it. That's the bottom line. Now, there's also a sense of cultural and social unease that this mass immigration is causing in all of us. And if I didn't talk about it, it would be just simply dishonest. There is a stark difference in what's going on, and it has to do with the difference in the way the immigrants were absorbed into this country who came between, from 1844 to 1924, and those who are coming in now. As you probably know, all mass immigration to America stopped cold in 1924. And it did not resume for 40 years. Now, what that gave us was time to transform immigrants into Americans. Now we have wave following wave ceaselessly. Mexican immigration has slowed, although by no means as much as Obama and company want you to believe. The main difference is the means of getting here. In the old days, 60% tried walking across the border. And by the way, if you remember how things were, just back in the 90s, 4,000 people a day were walking into Arizona. 4,000 a day. Okay, now you've got 60% who simply come in on legal visas and never leave. And who's going to hunt for them? Okay, no one. We have no group of people whose job it is to get them out of here, and only 40% come in on their feet. Asia is going to be the next biggie, both South Asia and East Asia, and how will that strain our capacity to maintain social cohesion? In the past, we made a concerted effort to Americanize immigrants, and that happened in civics classes, which we no longer teach. One reason that American kids know nothing about American history, about the Constitution, probably couldn't name their member of Congress. We had history classes that emphasized American exceptionalism. Immigrant kids took hours and hours of English after the regular school day was over, and language is the indispensable tool for molding national unity. And yes, English should be the official language. This is nonsense. And membership, we used to have fraternal organizations, service organizations, old world cultural organizations, Sons of Italy in America, the Pulaski Society, the von Steuben Society. These were great organizations. They didn't maintain division. In fact, they promoted acculturation and patriotism to the United States. But they're gone now. National unity was also forged very, very powerfully through universal service in 2 world wars, through the trade union movement, and also 40 years of intermarriage broke down a lot of cultural barriers between people. Immigrants did not receive any linguistic accommodation. Nothing was translated into Russian to make my refugee father's life easier. He learned English because he had to, and he learned it really fast, because my father hungered to be an American. This was what his dream was. My father landed on Ellis Island, 4 years, without a word of English and without a dime in his pocket. And 4 years later, and I have a photograph of him and his 2 brothers standing, looking like Russian peasants, with a suitcase with ropes tied around it. 4 years later, he's standing in his tennis whites on the steps of his fraternity at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, where he went on a tennis scholarship and where his coach was Bill Tilden. That's in 4 years, not 2 generations. He never spoke with an Eastern European accent. He used to affect a Southern accent. He loved the South. Patriotic assimilation is what we call that, and it was the melting pot, and it worked. Today's education industry and that's the only thing to call it. And the cultural elite instead embrace balkanizing multiculturalism, which denies the very idea that there is such a thing as an American nation, and it promotes a competing vision, loyalty to things less than America, racial or ethnic identity politics. They want our history taught as a story of racism and imperialism and exploitation. If you've seen any textbook treatments of Islam, pure lies. You think you're in a lunatic asylum. They are so deracinated, these people, that they're loyal to nothing concrete. They look at the nation state as evil. They equate patriotism with fascism. They want to outlaw saluting the flag. These are would-be citizens of the world, and of course they love all of humanity. It's just ordinary, everyday people they despise. And if I were to fall down in front of them, I don't know, they'd just walk over me or something, but they would be still, their hearts would be ringing out to the people in Cambodia while they walked over me. Being loyal to everything, of course, means being loyal to nothing, and certainly not to what the greatest conservative who ever lived, Edmund Burke, wrote, "The allegiances to which men are born." This dangerous mindset, and by the way, there's a lot more to say, but I'm going to stop pretty soon. This dangerous mindset was on full display in Obama's last State of the Union address. One of the things that's, every job has downsides and every job has upsides. The one upside is I get to travel around America and I get to meet patriots, and that is the most wonderful part of my job. The other part of the job is that I don't like so much is that if there's a primaries, I have to watch all the Democratic debates and I got to read all the Democratic material. And if you may remember, Obama said, look, if you skipped it, God bless you, good for you. If I didn't have to make a buck watching it, I wouldn't have. I would have rather have watched, NASCAR. But he said what the world admires most about our country is our diversity. Look, I've lived abroad for many years. I did my doctoral work in England, and I stayed there as an academic. I spent time with the U.S. Council for Peace in Macedonia, trying to get a ceasefire during the Civil War there. I actually advised the French government on their immigration policies, telling them, don't follow multiculturalism. If Muslims will not embrace French culture, get them out. Well, you see what their failures are. I know how untrue that statement is. What foreigners find incomparably admirable about America is not diversity. It's our historically unique capacity to take diversity and make unity. That's what they want. And I don't believe in hyphenated Americans. I am not a hyphenated American. I'm an American. Ask me what I am. I'm an American. If you've got other questions for me, where was my father born, or where does my family hail from? That's a different question. If you want to ask me what church or synagogue I go to, that's a different question. If you want to ask me what sports team I follow, well, it's the Yankees, okay? I'll confess. But the fact is that I don't like hyphenation. I don't like hyphenation. It's part of the fragmentation, disillusion that we're seeing. And some of our most core values are right now at play, and I think that's a deep cause of anxiety. Respect for the rule of law. We are governed right now by an administration, I just call it a regime, that has suspended the rule of law. And we'll see what happens in 3 days. That court case is going to come, Texas versus the United States. And we'll see if this outrageous Obama attempt to amnesty people based on the most bizarre notion of prosecutorial discretion I've ever seen in my life is allowable, and to do it without consulting Congress. But that's 3 days from now. We're going to get a ruling from the court. My guess is if Scalia were alive, we'd win. Probably it's going to go 4-4, which means that Obama will not get the DAPA amnesty now, but the decision will not lay a Supreme Court precedent. What we'll need to save the day will be a Republican president. That's the only insurance policy we'll really have. Preventing America from becoming a tyrannical state by seeing that it's a one-party state. And look, the long-term goal of this really a plot, and I'm just going to break out this immigration policy. A lot of the key elements of this come out of literally a plot among the immigration supervisory agencies of the Department of Homeland Defense from 2010 to 2012. We have the memos were leaked. We have the memoranda between them and how they went about destroying immigration law. The idea was, okay, Obama can't go out and say, I suspend immigration law. That he couldn't do. But if you take and you make the job of ICE impossible, and if you make the job of the Border Patrol impossible, and if you make the job of USCIS agents trying to ferret out who the bad guys are on visa applications, and they've done all three, well, if you can't enforce immigration law, you might as well not have it. And that's what Obama's done. He's made the enforcement of immigration law impossible. Our ICE agents are terrific. And by the way, you know where they are today? Well, today's Saturday. Every weekday they're home.
It's Friday.
They are told not to, Friday, I'm sorry. They are told not to come to work because their job is to catch people and deport them. And that's not what this administration is interested in doing. The Border Patrol has said they are told, don't bother catching anybody because we're not going to prosecute them. And USCIS workers who have flagged, which is what you would want a diligent agent to do, is to flag an application that raises question marks. They are demoted, they get salary losses, and their main office is in San Francisco. They get shipped to Nebraska. I guess the idea is that Nebraska is the American equivalent of Siberia, I guess. I mean, no offense to anyone. I know Nebraska's wide. I've driven across it a few times. But again, I mean, the main thing is that idea that our individual backgrounds are all secondary to a greater sense of national allegiance, that we are Americans first, that idea of e pluribus unum, out of many, one, also maintaining our Judeo-Christian heritage by curtailing Muslim immigration, which seeks to destroy, which seeks to give itself supremacy over those other faiths, and seeks to undermine, quite frankly, Western civilization. There's so much more to talk about. Let me just mention one other factor, which I think is really amazing. We live in a modern, high-tech, post-industrial society. And to be a success in such a society, the number one criteria is education. The data I'm going to give you comes from the Pew Hispanic Center, which, by the way, is interested in advancing Hispanic rights and concerns. They address those concerns. But it's a very good organization. They do good research, and it's credible. Of the Mexican immigrants who come into this country, 35%, and these are mostly indigenous peoples from the area, from Oaxaca province, 35% are illiterate in English and Spanish. 32% have not gotten a 9th grade education. That's true of only 1% of American workers. 62% don't have a high school diploma. That's true of 6% of American workers. There is a total misfit between the people we are bringing in and the needs that we have. And the fact of the matter is that this is not about, a sanctuary. This is not about, just bringing in anyone who wants to come. And some people, by the way, I'll just close on this. People think, I must be a terrible SOB if I don't want anyone to come into this country who wants to come. And particularly they focus on Mexicans because, they're right here. And by the way, Hispanic people are lovely people, and in New York I've got a lot of friends who are Hispanic. And study after study after study show the American people have nothing. Their attitudes about this are all about illegality. It's not about bigotry toward Hispanic people. It's nonsense, okay? But here's the simple question I have for you. We live on a planet which is inconceivably unjust. There are between 7 and 8 billion people on this planet. And the difference between living a decent life, which most of us are blessed to have, comes from drawing one of the best tickets you could ever draw in kind of the celestial lottery. We were born in America with white skins. Okay, we didn't do anything to deserve it, but here we are. There are 3 billion people who have half of what Mexicans have, and they have nothing at all. I was executive director of the American Anti-Slavery Group, which we rescued Christian slaves from Muslim owners in Sudan. I've been to refugee camps in countries like Chad. I'm talking about people who are skin and bones, with babies who are skin and bones, who are not like Mexicans who want to come, understandably, to make more money an hour than they could back home. I'm talking about people who, the difference between coming here is life or death. Do you want, then I've asked this to liberal audiences, and by the way, I've spoken to many liberal audiences, and I've debated, as very few people will do, I've debated on campuses. And I say very simply, do you want to we have about 320 million people. Do you want to take 3 billion people who have nothing? I said, you're Christians, most of you, or you're Jews, and you believe in being kind and being just and caring for the needy. Do you want to take 3 billion people? And nobody raises a hand. I said, gotcha. Because if you don't want to take 3 billion people, you're an immigration restrictionist. Okay? You're one of those bad, evil people. What I want to do is keep this country strong. I want to defend my fellow Americans because those are the people to whom I have my first loyalty. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about people elsewhere in the world. Of course we can. And America does more for people abroad than any other country in the world, probably than all the countries in the world put together. But we will not be able to do that if we ourselves become a third world country. Thank you very much.
I'm going to make an executive decision. One, if you'll pick up the blue sheet, there was a message from Joanne Fleming, our director at the bottom, and it also has the next 2 dates on it, which are going to be fabulous, just as this was. We have gone over, but it has been so rich today. So instead of questions, we're going to do this. We're going to end on this one card that I think says it all. It says, thanks for a good message. And if you had questions for him, Dr. Steinlight, you'll stay and answer. Rush the stage and ask your questions. But we do want to honor your time today.
You guys were so great.
Thank you so much.
Let's give her a big hand.
You were so patient. God bless you.
That was a great